So, usually when we try to picture a massive galactic military force, the image that immediately comes to mind for most of us is basically a sledgehammer.
Right, just pure brute force.
Exactly, yeah. You think of this overwhelming, undeniable presence, like endless ranks of heavily armored infantry locking step, the deafening, bone-rattling roar of drop ships just tearing through the atmosphere.
The sky turning completely black with artillery fire.
Yeah. It's this crazy spectacle of dominance, right? It's designed so the enemy sees you coming from, like, a mile away. And the sheer terror comes from the realization that they absolutely cannot stop you.
It's the mathematics of overwhelming force.
But today, for this deep dive, we're pulling from a really fascinating source text. It's called Sons of Deliverance, The Raven Guard and the Unseen War. And we're looking at a military machine that completely subverts that expectation.
Totally flips it on its head.
Right. We are leaving the sledgehammer behind. Instead, we're going to profile the deep and honestly often horrifying psychological trauma of the 9X Legion, the Raven Guard. This is an army that operates almost entirely in the shadows.
And the mission here today for you listening is to really unpack a faction that functions as the absolute masters of the unseen war.
Unseen war, yeah.
Because the text we are examining today, it doesn't read like a standard tactical manual, or some dry chronological military history. It's actually framed as a profoundly tragic character study.
Which is super rare for this kind of lore.
Right, it is. We are analyzing a group of genetically engineered soldiers, and specifically their leader, Corvus Corax. His entire identity is forged in this agonizing crucible.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle for him.
Exactly. They are torn between this high-minded, noble ideal of liberation and the incredibly grim, haunting darkness they have to wade through to actually achieve that liberation.
Let's break down that fundamental tension right away because it's so central, starting with their origins and the figure of Corvus Corax himself.
You really can't separate the two.
No, you can't. The text makes it very clear that you cannot separate the identity of the Raven Guard from their Primarch. And to understand the gravity of that for you listening, we have to look at what a Primarch actually is in this context.
It's a crucial definition.
Right, because we aren't just talking about a charismatic general who, gives good speeches. A Primarch is a genetically engineered demigod. They are crafted to lead.
And their psychological profile is literally woven into the biological makeup of the soldiers in their legion.
Yes. So when Corax carries a specific worldview, it doesn't just influence his troops, it infects them on a cellular level.
It's biological indoctrination.
Basically, yeah. And Corax comes from a homeworld with the incredibly loaded name of Deliverance.
Deliverance. I mean, talk about setting expectations.
Right. And the text drops this line that really warrants our attention. It says, he was a liberator before he was a conqueror.
And that single sentence fundamentally alters the psychology of, every single campaign they undertake. Let's look at the actual mechanics of that mindset.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
All right.
Liberator versus conqueror.
Because a conqueror is driven by acquisition. The whole objective is to secure territory, right? To extract resources and enforce subjugation.
That's all about taking things.
Exactly. The military apparatus of a conqueror operates on the mathematics of force, just pushing a front line forward and demanding obedience. The soldiers are motivated by strict top-down duty.
Or the fear of their own commander.
Right, or just the promise of the spoils of war. But a liberator operates on an entirely different psychological axis. A liberator is fighting to dismantle an existing power structure.
They are fighting to remove a yoke.
Yes. So when a military force is led by someone who identifies primarily as a liberator, the rank-and-file soldiers undergo this massive psychological shift. They don't view themselves as just cogs in a war machine anymore.
They think they're the good guys.
They view themselves as righteous instruments. They genuinely believe they're delivering the galaxy from darkness.
But I have to push back on that idealistic framing, just a little bit, because we are talking about a galactic-scale military force here.
Fair point.
The text positions Corax as this underdog revolutionary, right? He's the guy who grew up fighting in the mud, organizing resistance cells on his home world.
Running a desperate guerrilla war against a tyrannical establishment.
Exactly. But suddenly, the overarching empire, the Empyrean, shows up, hands him the keys to a massive established legion of genetically engineered super soldiers, and basically says, go bring the rest of the galaxy into compliance.
It's a bit of a shift in job description.
Right. So how does a self-proclaimed liberator rationalize leading a legion of unstoppable killers to force planets to join an empire? Isn't liberation by overwhelming military force just, conquest with a much better PR spin.
You're hitting on the exact paradox that absolutely torments Corax. And the source text indicates he saw this massive disconnect the literal moment he took command.
He had to have known it was messed up.
Oh, he did. He brings these pure, hard-fought ideals of freedom from his homeworld, but the instrument he is handed is an existing legion that has its own established, incredibly bloody history.
They were already doing their own thing before he got there.
Right. He looks at the veteran troops he has inherited and realizes a terrifying truth. You cannot enforce the concept of freedom using an army of tyrants.
Wow. Yeah, that's...
The cognitive dissonance is just immediate. He is expected to be a noble deliverer, but his soldiers are already accustomed to being absolute monsters.
Which sets off a chain reaction, right? Resulting in his first and perhaps most controversial act as a leader.
The Terran Purge.
Yeah, the source material refers to this as the Terran Purge, and it's a critical turning point for the entire faction. Tell us about that.
So the text notes that upon taking command, Corax was deeply disturbed by his legion's pre-existing methods of warfare.
Disturbed is probably putting it lightly.
Very lightly. Before he arrived, these veteran troops, who were primarily recruited from Terra, the cradle of humanity, were employing what the text explicitly labels as terror tactics.
Terror tactics.
It goes so far as to draw a direct comparison between their methods and another faction known as the Night Lords.
Okay, let's unpack that comparison for the listener, because dropping the name Night Lords carries a very specific, awful weight.
It really does.
If you are using tactics similar to the Night Lords, you aren't just defeating an enemy army, you are psychologically breaking an entire civilian population.
It's asymmetrical warfare taken to the most gruesome extreme.
Right. We are talking about, like, skinning people alive, broadcasting the screams over planetary communication networks.
Making horrific, gruesome examples of a few so that the many just surrender out of sheer mind-bending terror.
Exactly. So Corax steps into his new role. He looks at his veteran commanders, and he sees that they are practicing this specific brand of psychological warfare. And he hates it.
He doesn't just want to win the war. He is obsessed with the morality of how they win.
To a fundamentalist liberator, the means must always justify the ends. Or rather, the means have to be as pure as the ends.
Exactly. The application of pure terror, using psychological torture to force compliance, is the defining tool of an oppressor. It is the absolute antithesis of what Corax believes he stands for.
So what does he do?
Well, faced with this entrenched culture of terror, he makes a radical, incredibly severe logistical and cultural decision. He doesn't just reprimand his veteran commanders. He doesn't just mandate new training protocols.
No, he goes way further.
He amputates them from the Legion.
The text describes him sending these Terran veterans on forgotten crusades to the galactic fringe.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, and think about the mechanics of this move. It's somewhat akin to a hostile corporate takeover, but obviously with lethal stakes.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right, so imagine a visionary new CEO taking over a massive cutthroat financial firm. This CEO is deeply ethical and utterly despises the aggressive, predatory business practices the firm is famous for.
The practices that actually built the company.
Exactly. So instead of trying to, retrain the senior vice presidents who built the company, he simply fires the entire old guard.
Just completely cleans house.
He takes his most experienced operators and banishes them to the worst, most isolated branch offices on the planet simply because he's disgusted by how they made their money.
It's a massive purge. And while the corporate analogy highlights the abruptness of the change, we have to look deeper at the concept of purity driving this decision.
Purity is a dangerous word.
It is. In military and ideological organizations, the pursuit of absolute purity is almost always destructive. Corax is attempting a massive cultural reset to cleanse the Legion of its terror-inducing past.
But there's a huge cost to that.
A massive cost. By physically exiling half his fighting force, he creates a profound vacuum of tactical experience. And worse, the text notes he showed consistent ill favor towards any remaining Terran-born veterans.
He was completely biased.
Constantly prioritizing the newer troops born on his own homeworld of deliverance.
So he is overtly punishing soldiers, not necessarily for their individual actions in the field, but just for their geographical origins and the cultural legacy they represent.
Guilt by association.
Yeah, he is effectively playing favorites to engineer a specific ideological outcome.
And the psychological weight of that Night Lords comparison comes back into play right here. Corax was fundamentally terrified of what his own genetic legacy was capable of becoming.
He saw it in them.
He saw the reflection of pure malice in his own ranks, and his reaction was to violently smash the mirror.
Just break it.
But you cannot simply banish a part of your own history and expect the organization to remain stable.
No, you really can't. Let's explore the long-term cost of that decision, because you can't just cut off a limb and expect the body to function the exact same way.
It changes everything about how they operate.
Right. By overtly favoring the Deliverance-Gorn soldiers and treating the Terrans with such disdain, Corax baked a permanent institutional insecurity into the very DNA of his legion. He created a divided house.
A massive schism.
Yeah. On one side, you have the exiled veterans. They're festering with resentment on the fringe of the galaxy, feeling entirely abandoned by the genetic father they were literally designed to follow.
Which is a whole other level of betrayal.
Oh, absolutely. And then on the other side, you have his favored sons, the newer recruits from Deliverance. But those favored sons are now burdened with an impossible standard.
They have to prove they aren't the monster.
Yes, they have to constantly, desperately prove that they are pure, that they are the true noble liberators, and that they share zero genetic or cultural traits with the terrifying legacy they replace.
They are operating under the crushing pressure of ideological perfection. They have to be the perfect, flawless shadows.
Flawless shadows.
Which leads us directly into how this newly purged, theoretically pure Raven Guard actually structured themselves and operated in the field.
Because it completely changed their tactics.
The text shifts into an analysis of their culture, their organization, and their tactical doctrine. And the language used is highly specific. It describes their culture as being defined by a brooding intellectual temperament.
I have to admit, I really struggled with that description initially.
The brooding part.
Yeah. Brooding and intellectual are just not the adjectives you typically assign to a frontline army of heavily armored, genetically modified strike troops.
You usually expect them to be aggressive, highly disciplined.
Right, or perhaps zealously devoted. But an entire legion of brooding intellectuals, it implies a constant, heavy, internal monologue.
And that's exactly what it is. It indicates a complete departure from unthinking, rigid obedience.
They aren't just following orders blindly.
No, if a military force is defined by intellectualism, it means the soldiers are constantly analyzing their environment. They're weighing the philosophical implications of their orders and the tactical nuances of their engagements.
They're thinking about the why just as much as the how.
They are processing information on a much deeper level than a standard line infantryman. And the text notes that their organizational structure reflects this mindset perfectly. They utilize designations like Shadow Captains and a Master of Shadows.
A Master of Shadow. It sounds almost theatrical.
It does, but it emphasizes a philosophy built entirely around autonomy and initiative.
And that structural shift really makes sense when you trace it back to the liberator mindset we talked about.
How so?
Well, true liberators, especially those who cut their teeth in guerrilla warfare and resistance movements like Corax did, they require vast amounts of autonomy.
They can't wait for orders.
Exactly. If you are fighting asymmetrical, unseen wars, you cannot afford to wait for a top-down command from a distant general. A shadow captain needs the initiative to make split-second, highly lethal decisions in the field.
Relying entirely on their own intellect and situational awareness.
Yes. But let's examine the mechanics of how they actually fight, because their combat doctrine is where the philosophical tension reaches its absolute peak for me.
It's really messy here.
The text states their warfare is defined by speed, stealth, and surgical precision. And then it explicitly notes that they elevate the ambush and the assassination to an art form.
An art form.
This is where I have a really hard time reconciling their self-image with their actual actions. The text wants us to believe they are these pure, brooding intellectuals deeply concerned with liberation and morality.
Right.
Yet their primary methodology elevates assassination to an art form. How does a self-proclaimed noble intellectual rationalize striking from the shadows without warning?
Driving a blade into someone's back in the dark.
Yeah. Calling a knife in the dark surgical precision sounds like a very convenient lie they tell themselves just so they can sleep at night.
It's a euphemism.
It is. Is their intellectualism just an elaborate coping mechanism to justify the incredibly dirty, underhanded work of political and military assassination?
I mean, that contradiction is the agonizing core of their identity. Think about the ethical gymnastics required here.
They must be huge.
Corax purged the old guard because he found their terror tactics abhorrent. But is an unseen ambush inherently more noble than a campaign of fear?
I would argue no. Dead is dead.
The Raven Guard rationalizes this by arguing that surgical precision, so eliminating a key enemy commander in the dead of night to shatter a command structure, prevents a protracted, bloody planetary siege.
Ah, so it saves lives in the long run.
To them, it is actually the most humane and intellectual way to wage war. They view it as a mathematical equation. Sacrifice one life in the shadows to save millions of innocent lives in the sunlight.
Okay, so it's the ultimate the ends justify the means argument, just dressed up in the language of efficiency.
Very much so.
They convince themselves that because they strike with precision and because they do it in the name of an ideal, the inherent deceit and dishonor of the ambush is somehow purified.
The text literally describes them as the shadows that stalk the enemies of the Imperium, strike you without warning.
Stalking, like predators.
But to execute that kind of warfare, which requires immense deception, patience, and ruthlessness year after year, and still look in the mirror and genuinely believe you are a righteous liberator, it requires a staggering amount of cognitive dissonance.
That has to weigh on them.
The brooding temperament the text mentions isn't just a personality quirk. It is the visible strain of holding those two wildly opposing concepts in their minds at all times.
They are noble saviors, and they are terrifying unseen killers.
Exactly.
Let's talk about how that doctrine actually functions on a galactic battlefield, though. Because it's not just about, like, hiding behind a wall. It's information warfare.
It's highly complex.
I imagine it like a grandmaster playing a game of chess, but blindfolded.
Right.
They aren't just reacting to the board. They are manipulating the opponent into moving pieces into the dark.
Setting traps layers deep.
Right, and controlling the flow of information so the enemy never even realizes they're in a fight until the checkmate is already executed.
And that manipulation of information is key. This highly specialized autonomous doctrine of stealth and precision was devastatingly effective for them.
They were really good at it.
Unmatched. When you possess the intellect to outthink your opponent and the methodology to strike without ever being detected, you are practically invincible.
Practically.
It worked flawlessly, validating their entire worldview, right up until the exact moment they were forced into a scenario where stealth was mathematically impossible.
Which brings us to the cause and effect turning point of their entire history. Their immense success in the shadows, their total reliance on their own intellectual superiority, created a massive blind spot.
A fatal one.
They believed they could see every trap, which set the stage for their absolute worst nightmare. The source text moves into what it calls the crucible of betrayal.
This is the turning point for the whole Legion.
It focuses on a monumental event during a massive civil war known as the Horus Heresy. Specifically, we are looking at the drop site massacre on a planet called Istvan V.
The language the text uses to describe this event carries incredible emotional weight. It states that Istvan V was simultaneously their finest hour and their greatest tragedy.
Finest hour and greatest tragedy.
And it resulted in the Raven Guard becoming what is known in the lore as a Shattered Legion. We really have to look at the mechanics of this betrayal to understand why it broke them so completely.
Let's break down the mechanics of the drop site massacre then, because the geography and the tactical reality of that battle dictate everything.
The physical space is so important.
It is. A drop site, by definition, is a massive open landing zone. The Raven Guard, a legion entirely built around stealth, infiltration, and striking from the shadows, deploys into an open plain.
With nowhere to hide.
Nowhere. And they deploy alongside several other legions they believe are their firm allies, so they are entirely exposed.
And in that moment of total exposure, those allied legions turn their guns on them.
Just open fire.
Point blank. The text states they were nearly annihilated by betrayal. This wasn't a standard military defeat where they were simply outmaneuvered by a smarter enemy force.
Or overwhelmed by sheer numbers in a fair fight.
No, this was a calculated, point-blank slaughter orchestrated by their own kind. Factions they considered literal brothers in arms.
Think about the cognitive dissonance of that moment for you listening. You pride yourself on being the most perceptive intellectual force in the galaxy.
You are the masters of the unseen war.
Right. You spend your entire life studying the art of the ambush, analyzing every variable, spotting the traps no one else can see. And then you walk willingly into the largest, most obvious trap in galactic history.
Sprung by your own family.
And you are completely, utterly blindsided. The sheer intellectual humiliation of that would be staggering.
The failure of their perception is the true trauma here. For an autonomous legion that bases its entire identity on its superior intellect, being so comprehensively deceived causes profound institutional trauma.
It breaks their whole worldview.
The very thing they believed elevated them, above the Sledgehammer Legions. Their unmatched situational awareness failed them when it mattered most.
Failed spectacularly.
The betrayal shatters not just their physical numbers, but the foundational architecture of their psyche.
I want to frame this on a relatable level. Think about a time you experienced a profound betrayal of trust.
Like a close friend or partner.
Yeah, a long-term relationship or a deep business partnership. When someone you implicitly trust turns on you, the first casualty isn't just the relationship itself, it's your trust in your own judgment.
You start questioning everything.
You replay every interaction in your head, asking, how did I not see the signs? Am I that gullible? Am I stupid?
The guilt of missing the red flags just eats at you.
Exactly. Now, take that very human reaction and multiply it by tens of thousands of genetically engineered post-humans, and they're led by a Primarch who genuinely believed his intellect was delivering the galaxy.
The resulting guilt is absolute, and the text addresses this directly. It describes Corax as a Primarch who could not forgive himself for his failures.
He blamed himself completely.
He believed he was the ultimate mastermind, the great deliverer, and yet his own hubris led his sons into an open slaughterhouse.
And because of that biological link we talked about earlier.
Right. Because of that biological linkage between the Primarch and his legion, his crushing, inescapable guilt infects every surviving Raven Guard.
It's literally in their blood.
The term Shattered Legion isn't merely a logistical classification for a depleted fighting force. It is a clinical psychological diagnosis.
Yeah.
Their belief in their own infallibility, their very concept of themselves as pure intellectual masters of the battlefield, was irreparably shattered.
So given that complete physical and psychological devastation, how does the text justify calling the drop site massacre their finest hour? That seems like a contradiction.
We have to extrapolate based on their established combat doctrine. You have a legion of stealth specialists caught in a massive open trap with zero cover, zero shadows, and surrounded by overwhelming firepower.
They should have been wiped out to the last man.
The fact that they didn't just disintegrate is astounding. Their finest hour was born in the moment all their tactical advantages were stripped away.
When they had nothing left but grit.
Exactly. It was a display of raw, unadulterated willpower and survival instinct against statistically impossible odds. They utilized their autonomy to fight a desperate, fragmented withdrawal through the very forces betraying them.
Just carving their way out.
They survived, which is a testament to their resilience, but the cost was near total annihilation.
They survived the physical battle, yeah, but they were broken on a spiritual level. The trauma of Istvan V creates a profound shift in their identity, which actually leads us directly to the thesis of the source material.
The darkest part of the lore.
We reach what the text explicitly names the ultimate horror of the Raven Guard.
This final section synthesizes the entire chronological and psychological journey we've discussed today, and it serves as a masterful piece of dark profiling.
It really does.
The text makes a definitive statement. It says, "The Raven Guard are the embodiment of the Imperium's forgotten guilt."
The Imperium's forgotten guilt. That is a massive, sweeping statement. Let's sit with that for a second and unpack what it actually means for an entire military force to embody the concept of guilt.
It requires us to look at the full arc of Corvus Corax and his legion. Think about where he started. He began his tenure desperately trying to purge the concept of terror from his ranks.
He violently amputated his Terran veterans to maintain an illusion of moral purity.
Right. He constructed an entire culture around the idea of being the noble intellectual liberator.
But then Istvan V happened.
But the unimaginable tragedy of Istvan V, the familial betrayal, and his own catastrophic failure to foresee the trabem, broke him. The text describes the current iteration of the chapter as brilliant but haunted warriors forever scarred.
And here is where the text delivers its most significant revelation. It completely recontextualizes everything we know about how they operate today.
It changes everything.
It states that their defining philosophy, that brooding intellectual doctrine of stealth and patience, is no longer a tactical choice. It says, their philosophy of stealth and patience is a mask for a deep inner darkness.
The unseen war they fight has evolved. It is no longer just a physical methodology for defeating enemy combatants.
It's internal now.
It has become an internal, devastating psychological war against their own unresolved guilt, their trauma, and the horrific reality of their own capacity for failure.
Wow, so they're using their tactics as a distraction.
Yes, they use the meticulous, hyper-intellectual planning of the ambush, the intense focus required to remain perfectly silent in the shadows, as a coping mechanism. It is a highly disciplined distraction from the darkness festering inside their own minds.
So they retreated so far into the shadows, initially trying to be the righteous liberators holding back the darkness, that the darkness fundamentally changed them.
They became what they hated.
The text concludes with a quote that completely flipped my understanding of the faction. Let's examine this closely. It says, "They are the shadows that serve the Imperium, but they are also a reminder that the greatest threats do not always come from the darkness. Sometimes they are born from the most desperate attempts to hold back the light."
The tragedy of the fundamentalist liberator is that the desperate pursuit of purity often requires unspeakable acts to maintain.
You have to do horrible things to stay pure.
When a force is so determined to hold back the horrors of the universe, they frequently become a horror themselves just to survive.
But look at the specific phrasing there. I initially read the quote assuming they were desperately trying to stay in the shadows to hold back the darkness. But the text says they are making desperate attempts to hold back the light.
Let's consider the mechanics of that phrasing. Hold back the light. It inverts the standard metaphor where light equals goodness and darkness equals evil.
Exact. Wait, no, consider what light actually represents in this context. Light doesn't just mean goodness. Light represents exposure.
Revealing what's hidden.
Right. Light represents absolute, undeniable truth. It represents judgment and facing the harsh reality of what they actually are. After the betrayal on Istvan Vith, after the catastrophic failure of their intellect, and after realizing they are just as capable of horrific violence as the terror tactics they originally purged, the light becomes terrifying.
Because the light would expose their ultimate failure.
Yes.
It would illuminate the depth of their guilt. A legion that has been psychologically shattered cannot withstand the bright, glaring light of an unblemished ideal anymore.
It would burn them.
They're forced to hide in the darkness, not simply to stalk their enemies, but to hide from themselves. They actively hold back the light because the light would reveal the unbearable truth. The noble, pure liberators, they believe themselves to be, died on the drop side of Istvan Vith.
So we have to ask, what does this all mean for how they function within the wider galaxy now? The text says they serve the Imperium, but as the embodiment of its forgotten guilt.
They are the skeleton in the closet.
They serve as a grim, living reminder of all the moral compromises, the betrayals, and the hidden, bloody sins that this massive galactic empire actively refuses to acknowledge.
The things no one wants to talk about.
Right. When the sledgehammer armies we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive march through a conquered city in the broad daylight, the populace cheers. It's a clean narrative of victory.
That's good PR.
But the Raven Guard are operating entirely in the shadows, executing the brutal, underhanded actions that make the Sledgehammer's victory possible, and doing it in a way that no one in the Imperium ever wants to admit.
They do the dirty work.
They are the dark, necessary secret, and their brooding intellectualism is really just the quiet, agonizing process of them trying to justify their own existence every single day while drowning in their own guilt.
They are the manifestation of a tragedy wrapped entirely within a tactical doctrine. They demonstrate that sometimes the shadows are not a weapon you command. Sometimes the shadows are simply the only place left to hide because you can no longer bear to look at what you have become.
Let's wrap up this deep dive because the journey we've tracked through the source text is just incredible.
But a heavy one.
Yeah, it has. We started with the visionary leader, Corvus Corax, a man who tried so desperately to cleanse his ranks of terror that he exiled his own veteran forces just to maintain a fragile ideal of moral purity.
Which backfired completely.
We explored how that intense desire for purity fostered a culture of brooding intellectual autonomy, creating a legion that elevated the dirty work of assassination to an art form, all while desperately telling themselves they were righteous deliverers.
The mental gymnastics were astounding.
And then we examined the absolute devastation of Istvan V, the ultimate betrayal that shattered their trust, decimated their numbers, and left their Primarch consumed by an unforgivable guilt.
The crucible that broke them.
This all culminated in the terrifying realization that their entire modern existence, their vaunted patience and stealth, is nothing more than a highly disciplined mask covering a massive, inescapable inner darkness. They stand as a brutal case study in how the noblest of intentions can be completely warped by hubris, betrayal, and the psychological toll of an unseen war.
Which leaves us with a final concept to consider as you step away from this material.
Something for the listener to think about.
Exactly. We've spent this time analyzing how the Raven Guard masked their deep inner trauma and guilt with a carefully constructed philosophy of patience, intellect, and tactical self. It warrants asking a similar question of our own lives.
Oh, turning it inward.
When we meticulously curate an image of calm, quiet control, When we pride ourselves on being the patient, analytical, and unbothered ones in the room, how often is that patience merely a highly disciplined mask for our own unresolved guilt or fear of exposure?
That's a profound thought.
Are we truly mastering our environment, or are we just desperately holding back the light from exposing our own shattered pieces?
Until next time, keep diving deep.